There are some secrets kept out of shame rather than malice, some truths parents hide from their children not to deceive, but to protect them from the weight of adult failure, some revelations that explode carefully constructed facades in a single innocent sentence. What happened when 8-year-old Emma Thompson walked onto the Family Feud stage with her parents Jessica and Mark and her older brother Lucas, all of them dressed in their absolute best clothes, and smiling like this was the happiest day of their lives, was the accidental destruction of a lie they'd been maintaining for 3 months. That they still lived in a house, that they were still a stable middle-class family, that everything was fine. Nobody knew that the Thompsons were secretly homeless, had been living in their minivan in a Walmart parking lot for 93 days after losing their house to foreclosure, showering at the YMCA and storing their remaining belongings in a storage unit they could barely afford, maintaining the appearance of normalcy so their children wouldn't be taken away, and so they wouldn't have to face the shame of admitting they'd failed. They stood there trying to hold it together, trying to just get through this one day without anyone discovering the truth, not knowing that when Steve Harvey asked what seemed like an innocent fast money question, "Name a place where people sleep," 8-year-old Emma would answer with devastating honesty, "In our van, because we don't have a house anymore," and the carefully constructed lie would shatter on national television in front of millions of witnesses. If you've ever been ashamed of poverty you couldn't control, if you've ever hidden homelessness behind smiles and clean clothes, if you've ever watched everything fall apart while pretending everything was fine, you need to hear what happened when this family's secret was revealed. Before we begin, if you believe that homelessness can happen to anyone, and that shame is what keeps people suffering in silence, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because we share stories about invisible struggles that society would rather not see. Mark and Jessica Thompson had been living the American dream, or at least their version of it. Mark worked as a sales manager at a mid-sized company in Phoenix, Arizona. Jessica was a dental hygienist, and together they made enough to buy a modest 3-bedroom house in a safe suburb to provide for their 2 children, Lucas 11 and Emma 8, and to feel financially secure if not wealthy. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, stable, the kind of middle-class family that seemed insulated from true crisis. Then in November 2023, Mark's company went through unexpected layoffs, and despite his years of service and strong performance, Mark was let go. The severance was minimal, just 2 weeks' pay, and suddenly the family was down to Jessica's income alone, which wasn't nearly enough to cover their mortgage and expenses. Mark looked for work immediately, applied to hundreds of jobs, went on dozens of interviews, but the market was competitive and nothing materialized. He took temporary gigs, delivery driving and warehouse work, trying to bridge the gap, but it wasn't enough. By February 2024, they'd missed 3 mortgage payments, had drained their small savings, were drowning in credit card debt from trying to keep up appearances, and the bank foreclosed on their house. In March 2024, the Thompson family was evicted from the home they'd lived in for 6 years, the home where Emma had been brought home from the hospital as a baby, where Lucas had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where they'd celebrated every holiday and birthday and milestone. They had 7 days to leave, and they had nowhere to go. Mark's pride prevented him from asking family for help. His parents were elderly and on fixed incomes. Jessica's family was distant both geographically and emotionally. They looked at homeless shelters, but family shelters had months, long wait lists, and the shelters that had space would require separating Mark from Jessica and the kids. Mark and Jessica made a decision that destroyed them but seemed like the only option. They would live in their minivan, a 2015 Honda Odyssey, until Mark found steady work and they could save enough for a deposit on an apartment. They told themselves it would just be a few weeks, maybe a month at most. They put most of their belongings in a storage unit they couldn't really afford, kept only essentials in the van, and on March 18, 2024, the Thompson family became homeless. They lived in their van in a Walmart parking lot where management generally didn't bother overnight campers. They had camping gear, sleeping bags, pillows. Mark and Jessica slept in the front seats partially reclined, Lucas and Emma slept in the back seat that folded somewhat flat. They had a cooler for food that didn't need refrigeration, ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches and crackers and fruit. They had a membership to the YMCA where they could shower every morning. They went to the public library for internet access so Mark could continue his job search and the kids could do homework. They did everything possible to maintain the appearance of normalcy for the children and for the outside world. The children knew they'd lost their house. That was impossible to hide, but Mark and Jessica presented it to them as temporary camping, while Daddy found a new job and they looked for a new house. Emma, who was 8 and still somewhat sheltered from harsh realities, accepted this explanation mostly at face value, thought it was sort of an adventure, even though it was uncomfortable and she missed her room. Lucas, who was 11 and understood more, knew this wasn't normal, knew his parents were scared even though they were pretending everything was okay. But he didn't fully grasp that they were homeless, that this was what poverty looked like, that temporary camping had stretched from days to weeks to months. The logistics of homelessness while maintaining the facade of normalcy were exhausting and expensive in ways people don't realize. They had to keep up appearances so the school district didn't find out they were homeless. If the district found out, CPS might get involved. The children might be taken away. So Mark and Jessica used Jessica's sister's address as their official address, had mail sent there, used that address for school registration. Every morning, they'd wake at 5:30 a.m. in the Walmart parking lot, drive to the YMCA where the family would shower and get ready, then drop the kids at school at 8 a.m. Jessica would go to her job at the dental office. She'd managed to keep working, thank God, even though her income barely covered gas and food and the storage unit. Mark spent his days applying for jobs, going to interviews when he got them, doing odd jobs for cash when possible. After school, they'd pick up the kids, go to the library or a park, have the kids do homework, kill time until evening. They'd get cheap fast food for dinner, dollar menu items, whatever they could afford. Then they'd drive back to the Walmart lot, park in a spot away from the lights and try to sleep. On weekends, they'd go to free activities, parks and libraries and community events, anywhere they could be during the day that didn't cost money. They showered at the YMCA, did laundry at a laundromat, maintained the appearance that they were a normal family just going through a temporary rough patch. The shame was crushing for Mark and Jessica. They were educated people, had done everything right, worked hard, bought a house, raised their kids, weren't addicts or criminals or any of the stereotypes people have about homeless people, and still they'd ended up here, living in a van, lying to everyone including their children about how bad things really were. Mark particularly felt like he'd failed as a father and provider, couldn't protect his family from this, couldn't fix it despite working desperately to find stable employment. Jessica felt guilty that her income alone couldn't support them, felt like she was failing her children by not being able to give them basic stability and security. By June 2024, they'd been living in the van for 3 months with no end in sight. Mark had gotten a job finally, but it was lower paying than his previous position, and they were still digging out from debt and trying to save enough for a rental deposit, which in Phoenix's tight housing market was thousands of dollars. They were still in the van, still hiding it from everyone, still telling the kids and anyone who asked that they were staying with family temporarily while looking for a house. In July 2024, during a particularly difficult week when the van's air conditioning broke and they were sleeping in 100-degree heat, Jessica's coworker mentioned that her family was applying to be on Family Feud, said it was fun and they gave away prize money that might help. Jessica, in a moment of desperate hope, thought maybe if they got on the show and won money, it could be the thing that finally got them out of the van and into an apartment. She applied, carefully using her sister's address, describing them as a normal family who loved Family Feud, not mentioning that they were homeless because she was terrified that would disqualify them or worse, lead to questions and investigations. They were selected to tape in September 2024. The team would be Mark, Jessica, Emma, Lucas, and Jessica's sister Rachel filling out the 5-person requirement. When they got the confirmation, Mark's first instinct was to decline, How could they go to Los Angeles when they were barely surviving, when they didn't have money for the trip, when leaving meant not being in Phoenix to follow up on job leads? But Jessica convinced him this might be their chance, and they scraped together money for gas to drive to LA. They couldn't afford to fly, would sleep in the van during the trip like they were already doing anyway, would just extend their camping adventure for a few days. They told the kids they were going on a fun trip to be on TV, and Emma was thrilled. Lucas was excited but also anxious because he'd picked up on his parents' stress even though they tried to hide it. Before the trip, Mark and Jessica sat down with the kids and very seriously told them that when they were on TV, if anyone asked questions about where they lived or anything about their family, they should say they were staying with Aunt Rachel while looking for a house. The same story they'd been telling everyone. They didn't tell the kids this was a lie, just said it was private family information. That wasn't anyone else's business. Emma, 8 years old and trusting, agreed readily. Lucas, 11 and more aware, agreed but looked uncomfortable. On September 20, 2024, the Thompson family drove to Los Angeles, slept in their van in a parking lot outside the city, then arrived at the Family Feud studio the morning of taping. They dressed in their absolute best clothes, outfits they'd been storing carefully in the van, had showered at a truck stop that morning, had done everything possible to look like a normal, put-together middle-class family. When they walked onto the stage, they looked perfect. Clean, pressed, smiling. Nobody would have guessed they were homeless. Nobody would have suspected that the smiling family they were seeing had slept in a van the night before and would sleep in a van again that night. Steve Harvey greeted them warmly, going down the line, and when he got to Emma, this bright-eyed 8-year-old in a pretty dress, he knelt down and smiled. "Hey there, sweetheart, you excited to be here?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Yes! This is the most fun thing we've done in forever!" Steve laughed. "Well, we're excited to have you." "Are you good at Family Feud?" Emma said confidently. "I think so. I've been practicing." Steve chatted with the rest of the family. Noticed they seemed a little nervous but attributed it to normal stage fright, had no indication that this family was carrying a secret that was eating them alive. They played the first round, and the Thompson family was good, working together well, getting answers on the board, playing with the kind of unity that comes from having to depend on each other for survival. They won their match, which meant they advanced to fast money. Jessica would go first, then Mark would answer the same 5 questions, and they needed 200 points total to win 20,000. Jessica went first, did well, got 147 points, which meant Mark needed only 53 points. Very achievable. Mark came out for his turn, and Steve explained they needed 53 points. Easy. He started reading the questions. Name something people do at the beach. Mark, swim. Good answer, 42 points. Name a food that's red. Marky, strawberries. On the board, 18 points. They were already at 207 points total they'd won, but Steve kept reading to reveal all the answers. Name a famous George. Mark, George Washington. Number 1 answer, 36 points. Name something you might rent. Mark, car. On the board, 28 points. Then Steve read the final question, the one that would detonate the Thompson family's carefully maintained lie. Name a place where people sleep. It was meant to be an easy question, answers like bed, or hotel, or couch. Mark, who'd already answered the necessary questions since they'd won, said quickly, bed. The most obvious answer. But Emma, standing with the family off to the side, spoke up loudly in her 8-year-old voice, not understanding that Mark was the only one supposed to answer, not understanding that some truths should stay hidden. "We'll sleep in our van!" "We've been sleeping in our van for a really long time because we don't have a house anymore." The silence that followed was immediate and total. Steve Harvey froze, his head whipping around to look at Emma. Mark and Jessica's faces went white, Jessica's hand going to her mouth in horror, Mark looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Lucas looked at his little sister with an expression of panic and betrayal. Emma, realizing from everyone's reaction that she'd said something wrong, looked confused and scared. Steve's voice when he spoke was careful, gentle, not wanting to frighten the child but needing to understand what she'd just said. "Emma, sweetheart, what did you just say? You sleep in a van." Emma, now uncertain but having already spoken, nodded. Yes, we've been sleeping in our van in the Walmart parking lot since we left our old house. Mommy and Daddy call it camping, but Lucas says that's not really camping, that's just being homeless, but Mommy got mad when he said that. The studio erupted, not with laughter but with gasps of shock and distress, audience members making sounds of concern and sympathy, the producers immediately signaling to each other, trying to figure out what to do. Mark looked like he wanted to die, the shame of having their secret exposed on national television in front of millions of people absolutely crushing. Jessica was crying, her hands covering her face. Lucas had tears running down his face, looking angry and embarrassed and scared. And Emma realized she'd done something terrible, that she'd revealed the secret she was supposed to keep, started crying too. Steve Harvey stood completely still, processing what he'd just heard, and then he did something that showed why he was more than just a game show host. He walked over to the Thompson family, knelt down in front of Emma, who was crying, and spoke gently. Emma, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. You told the truth, and telling the truth is never wrong. You understand me. He stood up and addressed Mark and Jessica directly, his voice thick with emotion. How long have you been living in your van? Mark, his voice breaking, answered quietly. 3 months. 93 days. I lost my job, we lost our house, and we've been living in our van for 3 months. Steve's face showed devastation. And you've been hiding it? From everyone, even from the kids. Jessica, crying, explained. We told them it was temporary camping. We didn't want them to know how bad things were. We didn't want them to be scared, or for the school to find out and call CPS, or for anyone to judge us. We've been showering at the YMCA, keeping the kids in school, maintaining every appearance of normalcy so nobody would know we were homeless. Steve's voice was fierce now, almost angry, but angry at the situation, not at them. You've been living in a van for 3 months with 2 children, and you've been too ashamed to tell anyone, too ashamed to ask for help. Mark's voice was barely audible. I'm a college-educated man with 20 years of work experience. I'm not supposed to be homeless. I'm supposed to provide for my family. How do I tell people I failed? How do I admit I can't keep a roof over my children's heads? The shame of it. I couldn't. He broke down completely, crying, and Jessica held him, both of them sobbing, their carefully constructed facade shattered. Steve turned to the audience and cameras, his voice shaking. Do you all understand what we just witnessed? This family has been homeless for 3 months, living in their van, showering at the Y, and they've been hiding it because they're ashamed, because we as a society have made homelessness something shameful instead of recognizing it as what it is, an economic crisis that can happen to anyone. These are not drug addicts. These are not lazy people. This is a college-educated man who lost his job through no fault of his own, and our system failed him and his family so completely that they've been living in their car, and they were too ashamed to ask for help. He turned back to Mark and Jessica. You have been killing yourselves trying to maintain dignity, trying to keep your kids in school, trying to look normal while sleeping in a van. That's not failure, that's strength. That's doing whatever it takes to keep your family together. But you can't keep doing this alone. You understand me? You need help, and there's no shame in needing help. The producers stopped the taping immediately. This wasn't something that could air in its current form without careful handling. Steve Harvey made calls, mobilized resources, and within hours they'd arranged immediate temporary housing in a hotel for the family while longer-term solutions were found, connections with housing assistance programs in Phoenix, job placement services for Mark, counseling for the whole family, and the $20,000 prize money they'd won plus an additional grant from the show to help with rental deposits and getting back on their feet. But more than the money or the resources, what changed for the Thompson family was that their shame was finally visible and was met with compassion rather than judgment. People understood that homelessness wasn't a moral failing but a structural failure, that this family had done everything right and still ended up in a van, that the only difference between homeless and housed was often just one job loss, one medical crisis, one piece of bad luck. Within 2 weeks, the Thompson family was in a rental apartment in Phoenix, The first night Emma and Lucas slept in actual beds in their own rooms in 3 months, both kids cried. Mark had been connected with a better job through networks that opened up once people knew he was looking. Jessica kept her dental hygiene job. They began the slow process of rebuilding, processing the trauma of those 3 months, learning to not be ashamed of what had happened to them. The episode aired 6 weeks later with extensive context and framing about family homelessness, the housing crisis, and the resources available. Emma's accidental revelation became one of the most talked about Family Feud moments ever, viewed over 500 million times, sparking national conversations about homelessness, about shame, about the fact that people can look completely normal and be sleeping in their cars, about how close many families are to losing everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that homelessness can happen to anyone, that shame keeps people suffering in silence, and that compassion is what's needed when someone's worst secret is revealed, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we share stories about invisible struggles, about families surviving impossible circumstances, about secrets that hide suffering rather than sin. The Thompson family kept their homelessness hidden for 93 days, showering at the Y and sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, while maintaining the appearance of being a normal middle-class family. When 8-year-old Emma accidentally revealed on Family Feud that they slept in their van, when the carefully constructed lie shattered on national television, when Mark and Jessica's shame was finally visible, something remarkable happened. Instead of judgment, they received compassion. Instead of condemnation, they received help. That's what erupted when Emma revealed what her parents had hidden. Not anger but understanding, not shame but support, not judgment but the recognition that homelessness is not a moral failure, but a failure of systems that should protect families like the Thompsons and don't. Emma's innocent truth-telling saved her family, forced them to stop suffering in silence, connected them with resources they'd been too ashamed to seek, and reminded all of us that the face of homelessness often looks just like our own.